Well, I want to thank everyone for their day's attendance, and for those who are still here attending the last session, a special thanks. Well, we're going to try and make it go easily. We're going to show you some pictures and tell you some stories. Hopefully that'll keep you going. I'm Eric Cadora, and I founded and direct the Justice Mapping Center, which uses GIS, geography mapping analysis, to help sort of rethink and reframe our public safety strategies. Before that, I served as the program officer at the After Prison Initiative at the Open Society Institute Foundation. Was lucky enough to work with Susan Tucker, who I don't see here any longer, but where we kicked around ideas of justice reinvestment many years ago. Before that, I directed research and held a number of positions at the Center for Alternative Sentencing and Employment Services in New York, which is the sort of nation's oldest, largest intermediate sanctioning program in the country, and was lucky enough to co-author a book with Dr. Todd Clear called Community Justice, which focused on a review of the rise of community policing in the 80s, community courts in the 90s, and then started to consider what a new community corrections, in the broader sense, might be in the new millennium. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the importance of place in a way that we haven't necessarily talked about it so far, and how mapping has helped us sort of contribute to a justice reinvestment strategy and a way of rethinking public safety strategies. Then I'm going to turn it over to the real panelists who are actually working on the ground. We're going to turn it over to Frank Straub, Ph.D., Director of Public Safety in Indianapolis. Dr. Straub was appointed Public Safety Director for the city of Indianapolis in December of 2009. He has served for 7 years before that as the White Plains, New York Police Commissioner, where he and his force effected a 40% drop in serious crime by employing community policing techniques and effective analysis of trends in crime data. A man after my own heart. He earned his Ph.D. in criminal justice from the City University of New York, and he served as Executive Deputy Inspector General for the State of New York and the U.S. Department of Justice as a special agent. So we look very much forward to hearing from Frank. Sandra is President of Urban Strategies. Ms. Moore leads the team of professionals working in communities across the United States where mixed income housing communities have recently been completed or are in development. So a new twist here for us. She formerly served as the CEO of the Missouri Family Investment Trust, a public-private partnership entity leading Missouri's multi-system reform efforts. And again, we're going to be talking a little bit more about this multi-system issue and the new kind of public safety strategies around that. Ms. Moore is a graduate of Washington University in St. Louis and received her J.D. degree from the School of Law and a B.A. in Urban Studies. So we look forward to hearing from them. So let me start briefly, tell you where I'm coming from. The work we've been doing sort of helps us understand that the brunt of most correctional activities in the United States is borne by just a few neighborhoods in every major city in every state of the country. For example, New York City neighborhoods that are home to only about 17% of the city's adult population account for over 50% of residents sent to prison each year. In Houston, while 7 of the city's 88 neighborhoods are home to only about 5% of the city's adult population, they grapple with over a quarter of all the returning prisoners to the city. And in Wichita, Kansas, where parole revocations, account for nearly 1/3 of the city's admissions to prison each year, half of all people on parole live in less than 3% of the city's neighborhoods. So it's those kind of facts that we've uncovered under mapping analysis that helped us reframe and started to help think about ways in which understanding and reconceptualizing public safety needs to take place in a couple of ways. And the first way that we started thinking about this, and that we are hoping to sort of instill increasingly, is a focus on places, is a focus and a targeting in particular places. And so let me start by just giving you some examples here, other than the ones I have read to you. This is a map we did of prison admissions from the entire state of Arizona for a year, and it's called a density map. It shows the hottest spots of where people live who are going into prison each year from the state. And what you, of course, see here is the vast majority are concentrated in the Phoenix Mesa area. About 60%, in fact, of everyone who goes to prison in Arizona comes from that particular area. Now, you may say, well, that's where the population is. About 49% of the state's population. There's some disparity, but not a lot. The real disparities come when we focus down further to a municipal level and start looking at the difference between neighborhoods. And what we see here is, it's a little hard to see, but it's a colored map that is showing prisoners admitted, the most intense areas of prison admissions for the entire city of Phoenix, meted out by a sort of a half-mile by half-mile grid. So these are little half-square-mile grids that show hotspots of where people live who are going into prison. And you can see how much more concentrated it is in particular neighborhoods than others. The other phenomenon, of course, that we discover when we look at this is that it's not limited to criminal justice. When we look at other large government program recipients or clients, we found the same sorts of major hotspots. It's almost a mirror image of the correctional population system. But really, the disparities are dramatic. For example, we ended up focusing on a particular neighborhood in Arizona, in South Phoenix, called South Mountain. And what we found was, while that neighborhood accounted for only about 1% of the state's population, that one neighborhood, it accounted for over 6.5% of everybody going to prison in the state. So 6.5 times the proportion of adults living in that neighborhood. That is a sort of a neighborhood phenomenon, not simply a person-by-person phenomenon. And of course, that's replicated in all other aspects of correctional activities, whether it's jail bookings. We found 96 per 1,000 people per year going from that neighborhood, 25 per 1,000 adults on probation, over nearly 32 per 1,000 being admitted to prison every year. These, while the neighborhood next to it, Okotaki Falls, which has about the same population, same land area, same number of people, has a prison admission rate of about 1 per 1,000. So from one neighborhood next to the other, there are radical differences in the effects that place have and in the ways places are affected. To further focus in on this, we also wanted to think about what this was telling us, which was, in part, are our criminal justice resources organized around where people are actually living and affected by correctional activities. One of those ways was to start to bring the dollars that are being spent to, in fact, remove and return people from these particular neighborhoods each year down to those places, so that, for example, in each of these small block areas, we found what we start to euphemistically call million-dollar blocks. Small areas for which we're spending $1 million a year to remove and return people each year from prison and jail. And what that tells us and starts to ask us, and we started to hear that from Mike Jacobson and others all through the day, was that it's asking us about what is the return on what we could call, I guess, our public safety investment when we make those kinds of dollar investments, especially if we look at them collectively for an entire place. When we start to do what we were sort of talking about as almost an audit of a place, of a small area, and here we're talking about maybe 2 mile by 2 mile area, we find a staggering conflagration of populations being involved in the justice system, dollars being spent to keep the thing moving. We found nearly 150 people admitted to prison in that 2 mile by 2 mile area. We found 40 or so parolees, 300 probationers, dozens of juveniles in probation and detention, et cetera, but also looking at the expenditures. We found, of course, for that whole area, that small area, almost $11 million a year being spent to remove and return people. which was eclipsing spending that was going on even for TANF expenditures, food stamp expenditures, and others. And what that was telling us was that the criminal justice governance was dominating that neighborhood. That is, that's what's going on in the neighborhood. The major contact, the major exposure is to criminal justice when you think about government. And so one of the immediate questions that it asked us was, how can we retailer these remarkable resources? While these are challenges, they also represent a pool of resources that we're dedicating. How could we actually reorganize those around places? And that's in part what has helped sort of talk about and rethink this kind of public safety agenda as far as places go. And it has been embraced in part in Arizona and other states. Mike Jacobson talked a little bit about incentives today. When we see that we have multi-million-dollar spending going on to remove people, oftentimes from parole and probation, as it's been noted, to prison, what we have is sort of a financial disincentive for local innovation and local solutions. As Mike was noting, if we want to come up with a better way to work with probationers or parolees who are locally with us in our neighborhoods, we're going to have to come up with the dollars. Otherwise, we can send them to prison, the state takes care of it, et cetera. One of the most interesting breakthroughs that we've seen in justice reinvestment has been to remove that financial disincentive and create incentives, financial and otherwise, to come up with those solutions on the ground. So the legislative staff in Arizona was starting to look at probation failures and came up with legislation that looked at if crime is not up, if crime does not go up, and we can reduce revocation rates, the legislature will provide the county with 40% of the averted costs, which can then be reinvested in other sorts of local drug, mental health treatment, victim services on the ground in those areas. And we can start to retailer those resources in those places, right? And so that's kind of I think the rhythm of that's been going on in state to state when we think about it. We turn to Kansas, where very similar problems, rising prison population, forecasting going way out of control, looking at probation and parole violators, coming up with solutions, estimating the cost savings associated with those solutions, slowly bringing down that cost estimate and that prison population estimate so that we come up with what, again, Mike Jacobson was saying, real systematic savings, not just small piddly savings that are only sort of imaginary. Kansas did the same sort of thing, found that 40% of all prison admissions coming from 2 counties, looked at a close-up of Wichita, found that the vast majority of people were coming in from blocks and neighborhoods in the first city council district, again, in great part on the basis of parole and probation revocations. Very similar strategies, started looking at how incentives to support changes on the ground in parole and probation could in fact focus on a particular place where reformers joined with, I think something was called the New Communities Initiatives and other on-the-ground activities to focus on a particular place. But it also suggested the second way in which justice reinvestment is suggesting changing the way we think about public safety, and that is by broadening who we think, what we think public safety is and what agencies, what kinds of institutions should be involved. So that when we were starting to work with community development organizations already on the ground, it became increasingly obvious that it is the civil institutions, housing, health, employment, that in the long term are what sustain public safety. And so a new public safety agenda with a reinvestment approach is going to have to embrace work and development with civil society institutions, not just criminal justice reform institutions. So that's a lot of theory and a lot of examples very quickly I've thrown you. And instead, I'm going to sort of set this off to people who are really doing the work on the ground and can give you a little more detail on how this works and doesn't work. Okay? Thank you. Sandra? Oh, yeah, I think Sandra will start.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and This is all very interesting to me because I'm not a corrections gal at all in any way. However, I have had the opportunity to work before coming to Kansas, and I'll tell you how I got to Kansas in just a minute, with this notion of corrections has got to think more broadly and differently about its approaches. My favorite corrections leader was a woman who was the former director of corrections in the state of Missouri and most recently in the state of Arizona, Dora Sherrero. And she and I worked together in senior levels in Missouri government, me as director of labor when she was director of corrections. And she used to say to all of us sitting in the governor's office, labor and education and health and human services and health alone and public safety, which is slightly different in Missouri than in other places, that when all of our systems fail, she gets the product of that failure. And so we better think long and hard about what we're doing if we did not want her to be the most powerful director in the governor's cabinet. Well, if you didn't care much about anything else that she was talking about, you did pay attention when she said that, and that was the beginning of my looking at and starting to look at this very differently. And what I do in my day job now is I lead a comprehensive community development company. We are the not-for-profit partner to a pure development company that builds a product, mixed income, multifamily housing, as the lead in the revitalization of distressed communities. So we're usually called in as part of that team, the physical development team, and the team that I lead that plans for all parts that aren't about housing and streets and roads and bridges, but are about facilities and services for specific people who will live in that new place. We're usually called in when a community wants to try and change something about its existence, and we usually are called in when it's under some degree of distress. We don't get to go to the hot spots that are working well, and that's really how we got into Kansas, Wichita, Kansas. Wichita, Kansas was looking at this very significant data about what was happening in particular neighborhoods in northwest Wichita. The conversation was being driven in an odd way by the corrections notion that it needed to do something different about its approaches in locking people up and letting them go. And with the generous support of the OSI Foundation and the Council of State Governments, we came in, Urban Strategies came in with the folks in the state of Kansas and in Wichita to begin to look at what kinds of things could it do differently. But we had to frame the conversation ourselves from the community development side. And so we were able to, looking at this data, we were able to say that the challenges of people reentering communities would undoubtedly, no matter what else all the other parts of that community tried to do, what else they tried to do on housing and jobs, that reentering populations would destabilize those valiant efforts if there weren't some concentrated and focused and integrated approaches to what you're going to do to the neighborhood or in the neighborhood and what you're going to do with people. We pointed out some things that are really the same things you've been looking at, but let me say them to you through a slightly different lens in hopes that then when you start to talk to people who aren't in your field but whom you need, you will have these words. We said to them that the highest need for subsidized housing with some elements of choice are going to come from your reentering population. So that perked up the ears of those who are talking about the housing in that community. Those red dots, by the way, look at the chart. Anything that's yellow, blue, red is either vacant or in less than sound condition. So now you've got, think about the overlays, you've got the largest number of reentering and you've got the poorest housing stock. We said that the highest need for flexible approaches to educational attainment to support the reentering individual and his or her family would be concentrated in those areas. We said, whatever you think you're going to spend on services to enhance this neighborhood, the reentering population will probably be the largest consumer of those services. We said that the most likely abusers of any fine amenities that you want to put in this community, when you want to build your pocket parks and you want to improve on the nice activities in that community, the most likely abusers of that, if you operate in a vacuum, will be your reentering population. And with this data and that kind of recharacterization, Kansas and the city of Wichita began to think about how to leverage its investment in these distressed communities in a way that's going to make more sense for improving the neighborhood and thereby improving the platform on which reentering population will play over the long haul. That is wonderful, but it's one half of the apple. The other half of the apple is that the correction system, the probation and parole system, we would say, has to begin to think about its work in the context of a neighborhood, in the context of a place, in the context of places like this. Kansas correction officials decided that they would begin to shift their release and monitoring standards so that they could get some of these savings. And then working with a host of partners across every single system that could impact both the neighborhood and the population, the entire population, the returning population, their neighbors, the children of the reentering population, the children who live next door to the families who have reentering, because that entire community is impacted. They developed an action plan. The theme of the action plan: improve the neighborhood to ensure that reentering individuals and their families do not further destabilize, but in fact can improve as individuals, and the community as in total can be strengthened. That exact view, comprehensive view, I would argue, has to become the view of the supporting correction systems. Corrections, probation and parole, I would say even the courts in sentencing and returning or not people to the community. This approach in Wichita, Kansas, really focused on using the savings to support comprehensive revitalization of the neighborhood and support of the totality of human beings. It really helped strategically, not so much strategically, this is a strategic approach, but it helped politically to stop always starting this conversation with the reentering population, and really starting the conversation with, this is a community that has an array of individuals in it with a variety of supports that they need. And it really helped to get everyone thinking more comprehensively and less defensively about what needed to take place in the community. The savings for reinvestment arose initially from the justice system in the state system, and those savings were specifically targeted for this very tough district that you are seeing, and innovative things happened. I mean, we used state corrections savings and county jail savings to pay for neighborhood beautification in this community that employed reentering individuals and youth population. And you don't even want to know how much people told us that you can't put returning prisoners, we don't like that word, but that's what everyone who didn't want to do it kept saying to us, and young people together. But we did, with some good, careful supervision and some sturdy planning, and it really recharacterized the conversation to have corrections dollars, reinvestment dollars, paying for kids, doing something to revitalize that community. It's a whole new mindset. With the leverage savings, with the leverage that we talk about, the savings, the reinvestment strategies, and the comprehensive approaches, we were able to draw in the private sector to this conversation. And I'm running out of time, but there are two very important things I want to say about that. One, it was the private sector philanthropic investment that allowed us to go there to work. And it was national money and not local, but it really was the beginning of teaching the locals what they needed to do. That's very, very important because you have to start somewhere. Secondly, it is the private sector locals who frequently have to make many of the systemic changes that you all say you need. We had, for instance, Lockheed at the table as part of the private sector partnership. Well, they have a lot of jobs, and it is those jobs that you really need them to think about recharacterizing or how they will approach hiring people who need them into those jobs from this part of the community and this part of the population. So it really resulted in Wichita in a much broader, more comprehensive, integrated approach to revitalization of people, reentering individuals, and place in a way that made for a totally better community. So I'm excited to be invited to share a little bit of that with you, and I'm looking forward to more discussion later today.
Remember, the last shall be first. Also, I want to advise you that the Capitol Police are outside. You will not be able to leave the building, so don't run out of the session. It's interesting that we end the day with a discussion about place, which really it should be at the beginning of the day in many ways, right? Because it's the place that generates, in many ways, the activities that lead people to involvement in the criminal justice system and incarceration more specifically. This morning a question was asked in one of the earlier presentations, or rather a new question was referenced. And that was, how do we achieve the proper expenditure of taxpayer dollars in public safety investments? And today we've really seen a good part of the conversation relative to the investment of reinvested monies that we gained through correctional reforms. We've talked about corrections, we've talked about probation, we've talked about parole, we've talked about non-for-profit involvement. We haven't, although it was referenced, talked about faith-based involvement. One area that we have left out, and I have to thank Mike Thompson. I thank Mike Jacobson also. But Mike and the Justice Center has been very good about involving the police in discussions of justice reinvestment dollars. I think we need to broaden that even further to bring in other areas of the public safety sector: fire, EMS, animal control, emergency management. Let me start by talking about the police. The police are at the beginning of the entry process and at the end of the entry process. The efforts of good policing, or at least the model that's been in vogue for many years, is that good policing identifies offenders. Now we focus on the worst offenders and the worst activities in the worst places, and then we send them off to correctional institutions. And in fact, police chiefs throughout the country would be judged negatively if they didn't move those people out of neighborhoods and communities to correctional facilities. It wasn't long ago that I was in White Plains and I was having a discussion with one of my colleagues about police involvement in the reentry process. And he said, it's really pretty simple. Somebody goes to prison for committing an offense. They come back to my village, they commit another offense, I lock them up and send them off to prison again. I've got prisoner reentry down to a science. But what was he doing? He was putting a major cog in this wheel that we have spent this whole day talking about. We've talked about risk assessments. We've talked about strengthening the offender so they can be viable in communities. And yet we have this very important piece at the beginning and the end of the process who says, it's simple, send them back to prison again. I'm very encouraged by the remarks that I heard from my other panelists in the map. This is all about place. If we do not ensure that the places that we send ex-offenders back to are stable environments, it really doesn't matter that we're sending a stable individual back to an unstable environment. So this is where I bring in the totality of the public safety model. Because the police, by their actions, can ensure stability in public places, stability in private places, by targeting persons and activities. The fire department, code enforcement, can look at issues around safe housing, safe stores, safe bars and restaurants. EMS can provide tremendous data for public health officials in terms of what responses and what incidents they're going to. Emergency management can look at issues like flood mitigation. And so I think it's incredibly important that as we look at dots on a map and we think about what do we do with these dollars that we're saving, that we realize that we have to return people to stable neighborhoods. So I'll give you a quick example because everybody wants to go home, hear the president, make airline connections. But in White Plains, we had a particularly troublesome hotspot. And in fact, it was not terribly big. It was probably a street about 1/4 of a mile long. It was a street with 2, 3, 4 10 to 15-story public housing complexes, private houses, some commercial establishments, some auto repair establishments at one end, a public park, and a huge basketball court. Environmentally, and this is why I talk about emergency management, it was a neighborhood that got flooded every time we had a rainstorm. So you can imagine what it's like to go home and have your basement full of water and have your basement full of mold and dirt and refuse. So there's not only a public health issue, there's also an attitude issue. What am I going home to? Dirt on the street, right? And this goes to the whole broken windows, sense of disorder theory. Bars and restaurants that don't conform to the public hygiene laws, that are not safe places to recreate in because they're violating fire codes and building codes. Housing. Single-family homes where 25 or 30 people are living in the rafters of the attics, living in the flooded basements, using space heaters, tapping into the electrical systems coming into the building. And so we take people that have been incarcerated, who we have invested probably hundreds of thousands of dollars if not more, depending on the length of their incarceration. We've plugged them into all these services. We, in essence, have a whole bunch of services waiting for them, and then we say, well, go back to the house with the mold, the flooded basement, the overcrowded housing, dirty streets, unsanitary conditions, a host of public health issues that go well beyond H1N1, and be successful. We're wasting our money. So, in White Plains on Ferris Avenue, we used correctional maps to tell us who was coming back to the community, who these people were, what their risk levels were, what their special needs were. We used other maps to look at the sewer system, to look at the electrical system. And we looked at the electrical system to give us an idea of how much wattage was being used in the houses. We used the fire department to go in and do inspections to make the properties safe. And over the course of 2 or 3 years, we created a situation where we're returning people to safe geographic environments. And what we saw is a dramatic reduction in crime on that street, which really helped us because instead of dealing with reentry, we were able to deal with no entry. So again, thank you very much.
Let's take some questions with the last few minutes we have left here. Okay.
Were law enforcement involved, and what is their role in helping make a smooth transition?
Thank you. Yes, they were. An array of city, state, county, and state agencies began to work together in something they called leadership team, and now they've congealed those leadership teams down to by neighborhood. But the leadership team had police, local police, county police, people from the state. There were school officials. There was the state, county, and local workforce officials. There was, of course, health and mental health. Mental health being really important because that got us substance abuse. I mean, the leadership team basically had every single representatives from every single component of what it takes to stabilize the neighborhood and then support a specific challenged population. The police were wonderful, by the way. We used off-duty police officers as supervisors for our summer employment program, where we had ex-offenders working on teams with young people.
I'm familiar with Todd Clear's presentations, and I've used some of his slides actually to make a point that there's a point at which the removal of individuals does reduce crime, and then it starts to multiply. It becomes it makes it worse. And so in the work that we're trying to do, though, this infrastructure development, I don't see the funding for it. And I'm very concerned for people's being able to sit down and have those conversations and bring them in and to have it bear fruit. And I see most funding going to direct services and not to that kind of what you've done, Sandra, which is so important. I mean, that's really where it starts to come together. And this is why I came today thinking that maybe that part of the reinvestment is going to be taken seriously. Do you see that with the justice reinvestment? Do you see that potential?
I
And
do
how
see-
would we secure that?
I do see the potential. One, because the funding needed, what you're really talking about is that there has to be funding to staff somebody who gets up every single day and thinks about nothing else but how to get all these systems to come together, work together, set some goals, figure out some funding strategies, and go to work. And you're right, it's like any other FTE funding, it's hard to find. But I do see that the reinvestment dollars are, we've got a couple of models. Kansas isn't the only one. Council of State Government can give us other examples. I know Arizona's doing some good stuff, but I think the real answer is that it's not horribly expensive, and the return is evident fairly quickly, so that, for instance, now in Kansas, what we were being paid to do, now the city and state budgets are looking at funding that. So I think that as long as we keep these conversations going and keep demonstrating the models, the peel off of reinvestment funds to support jumpstarting the approach will happen.
Hi, thank you for your presentations and sharing your experiences with us. My name's Rebecca Newstetter. I'm at the Urban Institute. I'm the project director for a project that we have started recently. It's justice reinvestment at the local level. And we're looking at many of the same strategies, but it's playing out much differently on the local level. Ms. Moore, I feel like you were speaking a little bit about jail population reductions and reinvesting those savings, and I was wondering if you could speak to that a bit more.
I was, but from the state level, and the council and state governments and the state of Kansas had already, and the State Department of Corrections had already begun to implement some reinvestment strategies that were resulting in the savings. What we did was to come in and help them to figure out that if you just thought about reinvesting those savings in more probation and parole programs, and I love probation and parole, so I'm not picking on it. But if you didn't think about reinvesting those savings in a bigger context with really, I'm a carpenter, so everything looks like a nail to me. But the reality is, if you don't think about a housing strategy in these very tough places as part of it, then you are really not leveraging your savings to the broadest extent. Now, we got a tiny little bit of a breakthrough at the local level when the county jail system said, sitting at this table, oh, it was a commissioner, I think I've got some money that we can use for the summer program. It wasn't a whole lot of money, but I guess the answer is you've got to get people at the table and into the conversation, and you have to present them the innovation before they can even think about what they've got.
I'm Karen Anthony. I'm from Health and Human Services, and I love this stuff, and you could keep drilling and drilling and drilling. My guess is you could look at all the federal grant money that's coming in. I'm sure that's what you do, and you can identify where Head Start has some money, where, and then just a matter of linking people together, right?
That's right.
Do you guys ever get into things about jobs? How the Indians say that one call center job supports 20 jobs. You guys get into that kind of stuff too?
We do, but I want to answer a little something else. First of all, I had this in my notes to say these are wouldn't you say, Frank, these are multi-million-dollar neighborhoods. They're not million-dollar neighborhoods. It's $1 million of your corrections money. It's multi-million dollars of your Head Start money, of your after-school money, of your Title III money for, it's so, you're right. The biggest thing that we found out with regard to jobs is there is lots of money on the ground from DOL that passed through states and could get into these communities, but there wasn't a way to just open, to drill a hole into it. It's like there was no matching. The money was over here and the problem was over here. And because the problem had a high percentage of reentering prisoners with a lot of things that needed to happen before they could get the jobs, they just took the money and went over here with it. It was easier. So it's really kind of getting the match right. That, yes. Correct.
The way the justice reinvestment work we're doing right now in these 3 counties is playing out is that you need to get a whole host of people around the table. And we're doing a pretty good job of that in the spirit that everybody plays a part in driving the costs of the local criminal justice system. And, a big driver of that is, of course, the jails and the jail population. And there's one representative, one group of stakeholders who's not really at the table. I'm going to let you guess which one that is. Police, yes. Ding, 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 you got it. So my question to you is, I feel like I should know this answer myself, but we're really grappling with it. How do we get them at the table? How do we persuade them that this is something they should be involved in? Because, we've certainly had conversations with them, and what they tell us is, yeah, that all sounds good in theory, but the thing is that we're hearing from residents that they're really angry when we're picking up that drug dealer and putting them in jail only for them to see them back the next day. What are we supposed to do with that? They feel like we're not effective in our jobs. So I'm just wondering, what do we tell them? How do we get them engaged?
So your observation is excellent. Just before I went to Indianapolis, I got very involved in conversations around juvenile justice. And the governor created this whole juvenile justice initiative with everybody but the police. And so I started going to meetings, and everybody there was everybody but the police. So then we, just before I left, did a meeting with just the police. To talk about juvenile justice issues. My sense is the police want to be involved and they want to be engaged. But there are political realities, right? It's easier to clear a block, put people in some type of vehicle and drive them to a correctional facility and watch the door get locked behind you. And you get money, not as much as we should, and cops, I think, would appreciate this very much. The days of allocating money to the police to solve problems has gone by over time. Money to build partnerships has gone by over time. And I think some of the stuff that Sandra was talking about, one of the things that we're missing, and I'm diverting a little bit, but I think it's an important thing, as we talk about neighborhood stabilization, we also have to start to talk about metrics to measure the effect of neighborhood stabilization. Because what we do is we just shotgun resources into communities or challenge neighborhoods, and then we all pat ourselves on the back and say, we got some jobs and we did some of this, and the police kept order in public places and we sent them off to corrections. But nobody really measures A, the impact on the short term, B, the sustainability of that impact, and nobody holds all those partners that are at the table accountable with evidence-based practices to demonstrate that there's this correlation. So I think what we have to do is stop getting all the little spaceships that are floating around in the universe from floating independently and start to develop some linkages. And I think if we can start to show the police where by building stability and keeping order, you're going to actually solve the crime problem, you're going to get more and more buy-in. But the police typically don't get invited to the conversations. And that's why, at the beginning of my remarks, although I screwed up his name, and thank my colleague Mike Jacobson, Mike Thompson has been wonderful in terms of that. And I've been in several conversations over the past couple of years with my colleagues in cities throughout the country in these discussions, and this isn't a paid commercial announcement, but nobody asked. So everybody's in a silo, we're doing our thing, they're doing their thing, and once in a while we get together. So I think we need to be brought in. We need to see maps like this that help us, because we're losing resources like everybody else. So we need to figure out how to use our resources more intelligently to get a bigger bang for our buck. Thanks for including me.
I know we're coming to a close of a very long day, and first off, I wanted to say thank you for all of you in the room who stuck with us. 8 hours on corrections, spending, and recidivism reduction is a task, and you all deserve lots of props and extra credit. Also, I think it's noteworthy that we had over 200 participants today in this Justice Reinvestment Summit. 200 people that were at multiple presentations with some of the leading experts and leading federal and state and local leaders. To talk about these issues, and I think that in and of itself shows a lot of progress. And all this information that we've learned today and our great speakers, which we thank so much, are helping us to condense this and turn it into a report back to Congress, which is due very quickly. You know how things work around here. It's always at lightning speed. And we'll keep you all posted on the progress of that report and its findings and when it will be released. I also wanted to say very quickly, a thank you to the sponsors of the summit, the Pew Center on the States, the Public Welfare Foundation, Bureau of Justice Assistance for making this possible, and also our core partners in this work, particularly the Open Society Institute and the Urban Institute, VERA, NACO, and others. There's a long list, longer than we have time for, and I know everyone is freezing because it's about 62 degrees in this room. But we're so thankful that you've helped us bring these people together and have such a successful summit today. And as you all very much know, it's particularly putting on an event of this size on the same day that the President is going to deliver the State of the Union has been a very interesting endeavor. And the staff that have helped to make this possible and the bosses, their members that they work for. In particular, Tom Culligan from Congressman Wolf's office, Suzanne Raynaud and Nicole from Senator Whitehouse's office, and Jill Butash and Sally Moorhead from Congressman Mollahan's office. This event would not have happened without their support. As I said, come April or May, when the committees, when Congressman Wolf and Mollahan bring together this information, and we have some great recommendations and summaries from this summit, we hope to sort of convene again so we can keep this dialogue going. And with Senator Whitehouse's Justice Reinvestment Bill, hopefully we'll see some change and some more resources for state and local governments. That's it. Thank you so much for coming today.